heaven, we want to thank you for the privilege we have to be here this evening to consider your word. We ask for your help and guidance as we study the sacred scriptures, the 5th chapter of the book of Daniel. And Lord, in a very special way this evening, we want to pray for Maria's brother Luis. We ask that you would draw very close to him and grant him the blessing that he needs at this time. Lord, I also pray your blessing upon my son, and you help his shoulder to heal up quickly. And now, Lord, please be with our study and our discussion. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, so we want to read Daniel chapter 5. Looks like we need 4 readers this evening. And the third reader is going to get the bulk of it. So who would be willing to take verses 1 through 4? Okay, Larry's got 1 through 4, verses 5 through 12. Okay, Lawrence has 5 through 12, 13 through 28. That's kind of a big chunk there. Who would be willing to take? Okay, Betty got 13 through 28. And then Jean, why don't you take 29 through 31? Right? So we're in Daniel chapter 5, starting with verse 1.
Belshazzar the king made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords, and drank wine in the presence of the thousands. While he tasted the wine, Belshazzar gave the command to bring the gold and silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple, which had been in Jerusalem, that the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. Then they brought the gold vessels that had been taken from the temple of the house of God, which had been in Jerusalem, and the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze and iron, wood and stone.
In the same hour came forth fingers of a man's hand, and wrote over against the candlestick upon the plastered wall of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. Then the king's countenance was changed, and his thoughts troubled him, so that the joints of his loins were loose, and his knees smote one against the other. The king cried aloud to bring in the astrologers, the Chaldeans, and the soothsayers. And the king spake and said to the wise men of Babylon, Whosoever shall read this writing and show me the interpretation thereof shall be clothed with scarlet and have a chain of gold about his neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. Then came in all the king's wise men, but they could not read the writing or make known to the king the interpretation thereof. Then was King Belshazzar greatly troubled, and his countenance was changed in him, and his lords were astonished. Now the queen, by reason of the words of the king and his lords, came into the banquet house, and the queen spake and said, O king, live forever. Let not thy thoughts trouble thee, nor let thy countenance be changed. There is a man in thy kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. And in the days of thy father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, was found in him, whom the king Nebuchadnezzar, thy father, the king, I say, thy father, made master of the magicians, astrologers, Chaldeans, and soothsayers. For as much as an excellent spirit and knowledge and understanding, interpreting of dreams and showing of hard sentences, and dissolving of doubts were found in the same Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will show the interpretation.
Then Daniel was brought in before the king, and the king spoke to Daniel. Are you Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, whom my father the king brought from Judah? Now I have heard about you that the spirit of the gods is in you, and that illumination, insight, and extraordinary wisdom have been found in you. Just now the wise men and the conjurers were brought in before me that they might read the inscription and make its interpretation known to me. But they could not declare the interpretation of the message. But I personally have heard about you that you are able to give interpretations and solve difficult problems. Now, if you are able to read the inscription and make its interpretation known to me, you will be clothed in purple and wear a necklace of gold around your neck, and you will have authority as the third ruler of the kingdom. Then Daniel answered and said before the king, keep your gifts to yourselves or your reward for someone else. However, I will read the inscriptions to the king and make the interpretation known to him. O king, the Most High God granted sovereignty, grandeur, glory, and majesty to Nebuchadnezzar your father. And because of the grandeur with which he bestowed on him, all the peoples, nations, and men in every language feared and trembled before him. Whomever he wished he killed, and whomever he wished he spared alive. Whomsoever he wished he elevated, and whomsoever he wished he humbled. But when his heart was lifted up and his spirit became so proud that he behaved arrogantly, he was deposed from his royal throne, and the glory was taken away from him. He was also driven away from mankind, and his heart was made like that of beasts. And his dwelling place was with the wild donkeys, and he was given grass to eat like cattle. His body was drenched with the dew of heaven until he recognized that the Most High God is ruler of the realm of mankind, and that he set over it whomever he wishes. Yet you, his son, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, even though you knew all of this. But you have exalted yourself against the Lord of heaven, and you have brought the vessels of his house before you, and your nobles and your wives and your concubines have been drinking wine from them. And you have praised the gods of silver, gold, bronze, iron, wood, stone, which do not see, hear, or understand. But the God in whose hand are your life, breath, and your ways, you have not glorified. Then the hand was sent from him, and this inscription was written out. Now this is the inscription that was written out, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. This is the interpretation of the message. Mene means God has numbered your kingdom and put an end to it. Tekel, you have been weighed in the scales and found deficient. Perished, your kingdom has been divided and given over to the Medes and the Persians.
Then commanded Belshazzar, and they clothed Daniel with scarlet, and put a chain of gold around his neck, and made a proclamation concerning him, that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. And that night was Belshazzar, the king of the Chaldeans, slain. And Darius the Median took the kingdom, being about 62 years old.
Okay, thank you for reading God's Word. Let's go ahead and go to our outline, and let's begin to discuss the main issues. First of all, we want to review the structure of what we just read in the first 4 verses. You have Belshazzar's desecration of the temple vessels, and those were vessels from Solomon's temple in Jerusalem. In verses 5 through 12, the mysterious handwriting on the wall. In verses 13 through 28, you have Daniel's interpretation, the reading and the interpretation of the writing. And in verses 29 through 31, you see that Daniel receives honor and Babylon falls. Let's move on. Point number 2. Daniel 5 reveals part of the fulfillment of the prophetic dream in Daniel 2 as what kingdom comes to an end? The Babylonian kingdom comes to an end. So in Daniel chapter 2, of course, you have the vision that God gave to King Nebuchadnezzar. We believe that was around the year 602 BC. Now we are at 539 BC, and the fulfillment of the head of gold kingdom ending, and the next kingdom, which is inferior, the kingdom of silver, is now taking over. Babylon had one great ruler, and who was it? Nebuchadnezzar. When he passed from the scene, his son Evil-Merodach ruled from 561 to 559. So you remember we discussed last night that Nebuchadnezzar died in year 561. And so the next ruler was his son Evil-Merodach, who only ruled a couple of years. Then Neriglissar reigned from 559 to 556. And finally Nabonidus came to the throne in 556 and ruled to 539 when Babylon came to an end. And he shared the last 3 years of his reign with his son. And who was his son? Belshazzar. Until the Medes and the Persians overthrew Babylon in 539 BC. And at this time, Daniel was an old man. We believe he was most likely in his early 80s by this time. The transition to the next worldwide empire. So knowing just a little bit of this history, let me ask you a question. So why, once Daniel gave the reading that was on the wall and then the interpretation of it, he was given these gifts and he was made what ruler of the kingdom? Third ruler of the kingdom. Why is he made third ruler?
Who are the other two?
Because Belshazzar and son were co-rulers.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Belshazzar is not the sole ruler of the kingdom. The last 3 years of his father Nabonidus was the one who was ruling, but he was getting older, and his son the last 3 years is a co-ruler with him, being trained in to lead the kingdom on into the future. And so Nabonidus is really ruler number 1. Belshazzar is what? Ruler number 2. And Belshazzar says, if you can do this, I'll make you ruler number 3.
Wasn't how you ever say it?
Yeah.
Wasn't that Nebuchadnezzar's son, or was that a grandson?
That would be Nebuchadnezzar's son.
And so Belshazzar was his grandson.
Yeah, Belshazzar was a grandson. Right.
So the other
Yeah.
two were also Nebuchadnezzar's sons, Evil-Merodach and Neriglissar.
Yeah, Evil-Merodach was a son to Nebuchadnezzar. Neriglissar, I don't remember if he was a son. Yeah, he probably was a son of Nebuchadnezzar as well. We'll double check on that one. All right, let's move on. Point number 3. The story of Belshazzar's last night on earth reveals the tragic result of turning his back on the witness and heritage coming from his grandfather, Nebuchadnezzar.
Heritage, you said?
Witness.
Yeah, the witness and the heritage of his grandfather,
How do you spell heritage?
Nebuchadnezzar. Witness in the sense, remember in the last year of Nebuchadnezzar's life, he was born again. He gave his heart to God. And he had spent how many years out in the field like a beast? 7 years. Did Belshazzar, his grandson, know all that information?
Yes.
He was aware of his witness. He also, of course, being a grandson, is part of the king heritage. And yet he did not live, what shall we say, in dignity and honor of a true king. So he denied both the witness of his grandfather and the heritage of his grandfather. This foolish king led Babylon back into apostasy. and he refused to accept the light and the truth God mercifully revealed to him and his family. And we talked a little bit about that last night. God was patient with Nebuchadnezzar, and God worked with Nebuchadnezzar for about how many years till Nebuchadnezzar was converted?
39.
Yeah, between like 35 and 40 years, we believe around 39 years, God faithfully worked with him. And when he gave Nebuchadnezzar that last dream about the tree, that was God reaching out again to Nebuchadnezzar. And how many of you are thankful that God is that way? Patient, kind. His sole plan for all of humanity is to save mankind. And he knew that at the heart of this king, that there was potential there. You know, one of the things I praise about what God has done for us is he doesn't so much look at us for who we are right now. I mean, he does see that, doesn't he? And he knows us better than we are. But his main focus as he looks at us is not where we are at right now in our selfishness and pride and arrogancy and everything that goes along with it. But he looks at us in terms of what we can be in him. And so he gave much to Nebuchadnezzar and to his family. Unfortunately, Belshazzar decided to go another direction. Not only did he go another direction in his life, but he led the kingdom in the direction of apostasy.
But it was already headed that way by the evil Merodach. And
Yeah, things turned around. You know, isn't it amazing? People basically follow people. You know?
Don't we see that in the history of the Jewish nation? There was a good king, the people
Yeah.
were straight and narrow. If the
Yeah.
king went one way and went into apostasy, that's the way the people went.
Most of the people went that way. Yeah, good point. When there were good kings, the people followed the good kings. When there were bad kings, most of the people did what? Followed the bad kings. There was always a small group who stayed faithful. And in fact, through the Old Testament, this is kind of a side point, but consider it. In the Old Testament, those few people, consistently in the Old Testament, those few people that you see who are faithful, the Hebrew word is remain. They remain faithful. And when it's talking about them not so much in the verb form, but in the noun form, it's the remainder, from which we get the term remnant. You know, some people don't believe in what we might call remnant theology at this time in its history, but guess what? There has been a remnant all through history. A remnant who have been faithful and obedient to God and His Word and His commands. Yeah, no.
The fact that just what you've described is that the children of Israel, if they had a good king, they followed the king. If they had a bad king, they followed the king. What does that say to us today? We need to be careful about whose leadership we follow, whose leadership we follow.
Yes, that's correct.
That should not be an individual.
No, we want to follow Christ. We want to look to God for everything that we believe and everything that we practice. That is how we live our lives. And how do we look to God? We look to His Word. This book from Genesis to Revelation is the book that describes who He is and how He loves us. It also describes who we are and gives us an honest reckoning of who we are. And then it describes His plan and His will for our lives, which is our redemption and being a blessing then to other people and taking care of the world that He has given to us. And so, unfortunately, with King Nebuchadnezzar, he was converted, and then he wrote out his personal testimony. That's Daniel chapter 4 that we studied last night. And sent his personal, it made it into the biblical canon. But not only that, he sent that letter, that story of what God had done for him, the Most High God, His love and mercy, sent that to how much of the world? All the nations of the world. You know, that personal, that story of what happened to him, which probably most of us, we talked about this last night, most of us would have probably kept that part of the story hidden in a closet. You know, you don't want too much of the stuff to come out like that. Nebuchadnezzar wanted to tell the whole thing of who he really was and how God brought him to the place of humility.
You know,
And, yeah,
we may be surprised at how many people responded to that letter.
yeah, I believe, well, we talked about the last verse in Daniel 4. That's Nebuchadnezzar's last statement that we have in Scripture. And so we believe that Nebuchadnezzar will be in heaven. And there may be leaders of nations from that time who looked at what Nebuchadnezzar did, what God had done for him, and made that commitment too. We don't know the blessings that that letter did. We do know that Nebuchadnezzar, you know, he lived his life fairly strong, made a lot of mistakes, but he ended very well. And so his kingdom is pointed in the right direction. By the time you get about 30 years later and Belshazzar comes on the scene, Belshazzar has led the kingdom in the opposite direction. Nebuchadnezzar's was the direction of conversion and obedience. Belshazzar's was in the direction of rebellion and apostasy. Yeah.
This is actually the second time that Nebuchadnezzar has given a proclamation like this. The first time happened at with the image, because in verse 29, he makes a decree that every people, nation, and language, and then of course it's negative, but speaks anything amiss against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, something bad will happen to him. But there is no other God that can deliver after this sort. So this is another, the one we're studying now is certainly more extensive.
Yeah, the king was, and kings at that time, they were fairly famous for sending out decrees and commands. You know, in our country, I'm not sure how much I want to say here. In our country, it's not a kingship. We are a representative form of governance, which I believe is the best thing on the planet. It's not perfect because people aren't perfect, but I believe it's the best thing going. So we don't have a king that makes decrees. What we have is a House and Senate that makes laws. And sometimes I wonder what they do all day, because it seems like we have enough laws to run the country. And anyway, that's a side point. So these kings back in these days, they made all kinds of decrees and commands and sent them out. And once it was sent out with the king's seal on it, then the people had to what? They had to abide by the proclamation. And so Nebuchadnezzar's proclamations ended on the good side. Belshazzar didn't end very well. So let's go to point number 4. Fourth issue here. What did Belshazzar do at the great feast / party / kegger that blasphemed God? And I added that word kegger there is because that might hint towards a little bit of my past life. And that's what it was. You know, with all the alcoholic beverages that were there that night. So what did he do at this great feast that blasphemed God?
He brought in the sacred vessels and drank wine and
Remember when Belshazzar, not Belshazzar, when Nebuchadnezzar attacked Jerusalem, there were actually 3 invasions of the land of Judah, and the 3rd invasion, the city was destroyed, and also his temple. But the furniture of the temple and the utensils, everything that they used in the courtyard, in the holy place, most holy place, these things were taken, and they were taken back to Babylon and put in the temple of Babylon's gods. And so what did Belshazzar do with some of those vessels that were, by the way, back in the temple of Jerusalem, the temple services, that was to teach God's people, who were then supposed to share with how many of the nations of the world? All the nations of the world. That service, that sanctuary service, that temple service, taught something. What lesson did that service teach?
There was a Messiah coming.
Yeah, that there was a Messiah coming. It taught the plan of redemption, the plan of salvation, from beginning to end. And there were all these vessels that were part of that holy teaching that pointed forward to the Messiah who would come and give his life to redeem mankind from sin. So Belshazzar takes those vessels, which have been kept in places of honor in the temples at Babylon. He took some of those vessels, brought them into the party, and blasphemed the God of heaven and praised his gods, the quotes, gods of gold and silver and wood. And so these, back to our point here, these sacred vessels from the temple of God in Jerusalem had always been handled with reverence by King Nebuchadnezzar. Now, I've had some people say, well, how could he handle them in reverence? He put them in the temple of his, quotes, gods.
That was the highest place of honor that he had.
And see, that's the deal. It's true that if you take the things of God and put them in a place that is not the place of God, we might look at that and say, that's not the best thing to do. But from Nebuchadnezzar's standpoint, that was the highest place.
Sort of a sign of respect.
Yeah, it was a sign of respect and honor. Nebuchadnezzar had respect and honor towards the, quote, gods of the world. He believed that, he was, what do you call it?
Multi-theistic.
Yeah, polytheistic in his views. He had respect to the, quotes, different gods of the nations. And he gave honor to them. And so the highest place that he had to keep something like that was in the temples of that they set up to worship their gods. Yeah,
Belshazzar had a choice. I'm sure in the temple there were other vessels,
Yes,
other
there
cups
were.
and things from
all kinds of stuff he
worshiping
could have used.
their God,
Yeah,
instead of saying specifically, I want that stuff from Jerusalem.
yeah. But he wouldn't, think about this. Yeah, so he had choices of, he didn't have to go to any of the temples to use any of that stuff. And he would not, for example, he would not go to the temple of his moon god and take some of those vessels and have a party with his concubines with. He would not do that. And why do you suppose he would not do that?
Fear.
Fear. He's afraid he'd upset the moon god. But he's very happy to use the vessels from the temple of the God of Israel. He was, what was that?
You know who was behind that thought?
Yeah. Who was behind that thought? It was the devil. Go back a couple chapters, we remember the theme in the book of Daniel is not about Nebuchadnezzar. It's not about the statue in the plain of Dura, it's not about the fiery furnace. What is it about? It's about worship. And in terms of true worship, there's the God of heaven, the God of the universe, and then on the other side, there's the arch enemy, and that is the devil. And the book of Daniel is really all about who are you going to worship, who are you going to serve. And God lays out his plan of how history unfolds and his dealings and workings with mankind to save them from their sin. So, are we done with point number 4 there yet?
No.
So these sacred vessels from the temple of God in Jerusalem had always been handled with reverence by King Nebuchadnezzar, but this unwise king treated them, you can use whatever word you want me to use it. I'm using the word sacrilegiously,
That's a good word.
with dishonor. Thus God held him accountable, as he will all who do not worship him. Point number 5. So God sent a message etched into the wall by a supernatural hand. You know, sometimes when I read stories in the Bible, sometimes I say, you know what, I would have liked to have been there. I'm not sure I would have liked to have seen that moment. You know, all of a sudden a hand appears. And these guys have been probably partying for a while. And they might have thought, oh wow, isn't that something, you know? But that hand moves across the party line, so to speak, and it floats over to the wall above a candlestick, by the way. We'll talk about that here in a few minutes. That's over against the wall, and the hand etches into the plaster wall a message. And it stays there and glows. And so God sent a message by this supernatural hand. So let's talk about that. What was the writing? Yeah, the writing was a warning.
Final judgment.
Yeah, it's a message of final judgment. Could the wise men were called in? You know, it seems like all along the way here, almost every chapter, the kings called the wise men in.
Yeah.
And up to this point, how did that work?
They lost the World Series.
Yeah, they're already 4 and gone. So they're 0-4. Huh? And so, how did that work out? These guys could not even read what was on the wall, let alone interpret it. And so, who was called in to read it and give the message? Daniel was the queen mother. Let her son know, hey, there's a man here that has a whole lot more understanding and wisdom than anybody else in the kingdom. Not only that, he has interpretation of dreams. Go ahead and call him. His name is Daniel. He was also called Belteshazzar.
Was it his mother or was it his grandmother?
Most of the material I've read say that it's his mother, so that would be the queen mother. Because remember, Nabonidus is ruling. Belshazzar is like a co-ruler, a vassal ruler. And so the queen mother, she finds out about the party. And
He didn't invite her.
yeah, obviously she wasn't at the party the whole time. But she comes in, she hears about the ruckus. She comes in, she sees the setting. She knows that we're in trouble. And none of the wise men can do anything. Yeah, maybe.
Is that written in Hebrew? Is that what
The
language?
words on the wall were written in Aramaic, which is similar to Hebrew.
So they didn't understand that.
They did not understand that. But Daniel recognized it immediately.
It's possible they couldn't even look at it, because remember when Moses came down from the mountain?
Yeah, I didn't think of it from that angle.
You suppose it was the same hand that the finger wrote the Ten Commandments?
I think it probably was. I don't know how God can do that, but He does not, He lives outside of, you and I were,
Material.
we're material.
Time and space limited.
We have so many dimensions, and that's what we're limited to. And the angels of heaven have a dimension that we don't have. They can just show up and then leave, and they're gone again. You and I can't do that. They can, and God is above the angels. So God can send His hand and etch it into the drywall of our wall here.
I read that God wrote 3 things. He wrote the Ten Commandments, He wrote that on the wall, and He wrote in the dust.
Yes.
And so that hand was God.
Yeah. And when the hand wrote in the dust, that this miraculous hand became human, took on flesh, and He wrote it in
Jesus.
the dust of
Sins.
the ground, so that when the wind came, it would blow away. It sent the message at the time, but then it was erased after that. This message on this wall that we're reading about tonight, that message stayed there. And then the Medes and Persians took the kingdom. And who knows what they did with the message on the wall. So the message, so Daniel's called in. So let's talk about that for a minute. Daniel's called in. He's an old man now. And, this is where I would like to have been there, to see Daniel walking in, looking up at the wall briefly, walking over to the king and having a little chat with him. Gives a little sermon. And you can almost see Daniel coming in and saying, okay, the wise guys, they can't do it again.
Did they have a smirk on his face?
I don't know if Daniel had if he had a little bit of a sense of humor, maybe, but he was never disrespectful.
Well, he definitely greeted the king differently than he did Nebuchadnezzar, because he always started, "O king, live forever."
Yeah.
This time it's, give your gifts to someone
Well,
else.
he saw the party scene. He saw the king. He saw, the ladies. He saw the whole setting there. He saw the handwriting on the wall, and he knew that this king was doomed that night. So he was not going to be dishonest, was he? He was not going to say, "Oh, king, live forever," because he knew the king's life was about to come to an end.
And be in third place when the monarchy falls is not a good place to be.
No, that's why Daniel said, you can do what with your gifts?
Give it to someone else.
You can keep it, you give it to someone else. This thing's going down, and yeah. So, let's go to point number 6 there. And this is where I've kind of reworded it in my notes here. But let's look at the wording there. The wording is mene, the wording is tekel, and then the wording is upharsin, and in the interpretation, peres. And the reason why is because the word peres is the root word for upharsin. It's spelled, the word peres, in the Aramaic and the Hebrew language. At first, the language was just all consonants, and then later the vowels were added. And so scholars believe that they have added, or they are able to translate, the proper vowels. So with the word peres there, the consonant were P-R-S, and those were the main consonants for the name upharsin. And if it was P-A-R-A-S, that meant Persia. But if it was P-E-R-E-S, that meant divided. And so there are Hebrew scholars and Aramaic scholars who look at that word there and they say, okay, the root word probably means both things, divided and Persia. And some theologians believe that God was maybe doing a little word play there, sending the message to Belshazzar that your kingdom is divided and it's given to the Medes and Persians. And that's the way Daniel interpreted it.
There was a text from that.
Yeah.
How popular at that time was the Aramaic language?
Well, from what I understand, it was fairly common.
If that's the case, then why couldn't these wise men then know what that said?
They weren't very wise.
They were drunk.
And they may have been drunk.
Maybe they had some idea of what it said and they wasn't.
Yeah, that could be. It's just, the text is pretty plain that they were not able to read the handwriting on the wall. They weren't able to read it, let alone, give the interpretation.
That's possible. It's because, have you ever tried to read the wattage on a light bulb while it's on?
Okay. That's good. Did you hear what Larry said? Yeah, can you read the wattage on a light bulb when it's on? I've never looked at a light bulb. Well, I have. It just doesn't work very well to look at a light bulb when it's on. Let's cover so the word mene. What does the word mene mean? In the Aramaic language, it means numbered. The word tekel, yeah, it means weighed. And of course, Upharsin and Paris mean divided. It also means Persia. So you put that, so numbered, weighed, divided, Persia. Daniel put that thing together, and what was the interpretation?
Your toast.
God, yeah, yeah. Let's keep it short. You're toast. Yeah. God has numbered your kingdom. You've been weighed in the balances of heaven. You've been weighed in the scale of heaven, and you're found wanting. Your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. And that night, Belshazzar lost his life. I think we have a couple of hands up here. Yeah.
Oh, just going back to the last point, I kind of wonder if the message remaining on the wall was also for the Medes and the Persians to say, this God who put you in power, you better listen up.
That may be. We know that it's only a short while later where Darius is meeting with Daniel. And Darius finds something out. You know what Darius finds out as he questions this old man?
His name's in the Bible.
Well,
Or is it Cyrus?
Cyrus.
yeah, that was Cyrus. He finds out that Daniel was the prime minister of the kingdom under Nebuchadnezzar. And when he finds that out, and we'll read this in the next chapter, when he finds that out, he desires to make Daniel, who's an old man and a captive of Judah, the prime minister for his kingdom. If this man helped to rule when Babylon was at its height and doing well, what might he be able to do in helping me as I set up my administration? Point number 7, the message was written upon the wall. Notice, the message was written upon the wall where, I have in quotes, the candlestick was. Not a candlestick, but what? The candlestick. It is possible that the candlestick referred to here was taken from, guess where? Solomon's temple. Thus, light was shed not only on the message of judgment, but also on the reason for it. So let's think about that for a moment. If this candlestick was just part of the regular furniture in this room where this party is taking place, Hebrew scholars believe that it would be described as a candlestick. That it has the definite article. If it was just a general item of furniture in the room, it wouldn't have, Hebrew scholars believe it wouldn't have the definite article. It would have the indefinite article. But this one has the definite article. The candlestick, in the context of the vessels being brought from the temple into their party to praise the, quotes, praise the gods of gold and silver. And so many Bible scholars believe that one of the vessels that was brought into the party was the candlestick.
The seven,
The menorah.
The menorah, the seven-branch candlestick.
It helped illuminate the party.
So this is the deal. God sees everything that's happening in that room. He sees these vessels that were dedicated for pointing out the great plan of redemption for all humanity. And he sees the candlestick over against the wall. And he chooses that place above the candlestick to put the message of judgment. He could have gone to any other wall, but no, it's the wall that has what? The candlestick. That writes the message of judgment. So, let's go back to this last sentence in point number 7. Thus light was shed not only on the message of judgment, but also on the reason for it. What might that reason be? You know, if this is true, and I believe it is, if it's true, why does God choose to write the message above the candlestick? Yeah, what did the candlestick represent?
Christ was the light of the
It represented light, and that light represented the Messiah who would be the light of the world, who would shine and shed truth in the hearts and minds of people so that they could be lights and then let their light shine. The candlestick also was the energy and the fuel for the candlestick was what? The oil, a symbol of the Holy Spirit. And could it be that God was writing the message of judgment above the candlestick because the king had turned his back on the Spirit of God? The king had turned his back on the God who would give his only begotten Son, who would be the light of the world. And what else?
He was taking the place.
And he was taking the place of these things. And so God sent the very clear message of judgment. Not only of judgment, but the reason for it. You have turned your back on the light that God has given. Last point, and this is just a thought for us. Within 2 chapters of Daniel, and that would be, I'm talking about chapters 4 and 5. We did 4 last night, 5 tonight. Within the 2 chapters of Daniel, 2 very different men are portrayed. Nebuchadnezzar and his conversion, and Belshazzar and his what? Rebellion. Each one shows how he would respond to God's light. And the question is this that I would like us to think about as we conclude. How will we apply God's light in our lives when He makes it available to us? God brought light to Nebuchadnezzar and was patient with him. Nebuchadnezzar responded positively. Belshazzar, God brought light to Belshazzar as he was growing up as a boy and as he became a man. And Belshazzar chose to turn away from the life that God provided. So the question tonight is, will we be like King Nebuchadnezzar or King Belshazzar? I want to be like Nebuchadnezzar. What about you? Amen. Any other comments or questions on tonight's study? Yes, Maggie?
It also was in God's timing.
Yes.
It was in God's timing. I mean, you know, we can take this way out of the box, which we're not going to do, but if Belshazzar would have accepted it and Babylon would have gone on, that wasn't God's timing. It was the plan that God knew, of course, at the end from the beginning, but this was all planned. He knew what was going to happen. So.
And that's in the first part of our outline. We point out that chapter 5 is really portraying chapter 2 with the Babylonian kingdom coming to an end. And so in Daniel chapter 2, God showed Nebuchadnezzar, somewhere around, before the 6th century BC moves into the 5th century BC, God shows him how world history would unfold. And so world history began to unfold that way as you get to Daniel chapter 5. When we get into further chapters, we're going to see in a prophetic context of how the Medo-Persian Empire comes to an end, and then the next empire comes. And then by the time you get to the New Testament, the fourth worldwide kingdom, the Lake of Irons, is ruling at that time. The iron monarchy of what?
Rome.
Of Rome. And so in the biblical era, in the Bible, Old Testament times and New Testament times, we see pictures of these four worldwide kingdoms. And God, way back in the times of Nebuchadnezzar, said this is how it's going to unfold. And it did. So that teaches us something. What does it teach us?
God predicts the future.
Yeah, God predicts the future. And if God can predict the future, then God is what?
Omnipotent.
Yeah, he's omnipotent, he's
He
omniscient.
trusted, he knows.
He knows he's the ruler and the sovereign of the universe. And that ruler and sovereign of the universe was interested in the hearts and the minds of pagan kings like Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar.
And you know what, he's in control.
God's in control.
It also shows that we can and should believe the rest of the story in Revelation. That
Yes.
It's going to happen exactly the way
Yes.
it's spelled out.
Yeah. Yeah, we're reading through what we call the historical portion of the book of Daniel. And we see in that historical portion everything coming to be just as God said. And we also see within that the issue of worship. We also see within that individuals making choices for God or unfortunately against. And God's still in control of the universe. He's still in control of our planet. He still sets up kings and takes them down. Larry and I talked about that a little bit last night. God rules. And some people don't like that idea. They think that might sound kind of harsh. But this God is a loving God. He's a merciful God. And He sent His only begotten Son to show us His love and to redeem us from sin. And praise God that that God who rules the universe is that kind of God. Any other questions or thoughts? Edna?
What was the extent of the Babylonian and Medo-Persian Empire geographically? Did they extend into India and China and around that?
I believe it did. It extended to what we might call the then known world, which would go to the far edges of Western Europe, to the Atlantic Ocean, and it would go east into India and Asia. And certainly north and south. It can't go too far north because these kingdoms, these stories that we are reading are in the northern hemisphere anyway. But it certainly went down south into Egypt and into Africa. And that was kind of what we call the then known world. It may very well have reached into the Americas as well. But at least with science and archaeology, I'm not aware of much produced in the Americas that are linked to Babylon. I don't know, maybe some of you might have read. Yeah, Maggie, go ahead.
Oh, I just was, there's a lot of talk nowadays about the new Pope and whatever the Pope is doing. But again, God has got a plan.
Yeah.
And it's going to go according to God's plan. Whoever the Pope is, or whoever the President is, or whoever is.
Yeah.
God has got a plan, and He puts up kings and He takes them down.
Yes.
And if it's not going according to His plan, something else is going to work out. So, we can be at peace about it and not be stressed about it and just trust God's plan.
Well, and that's a good point because, next week we're going to start getting into the prophetic portions of the book of Daniel. And in the prophetic portions of the book of Daniel, we are going to learn about what these beasts represent. We're going to learn what the horns represent. We're going to learn what the little horn represents. We're going to learn what the movements are between the king of the north and the king of the south. We're going to learn all this stuff. But remember, the prophetic portion is set in the context in the book of Daniel into the historical portion. And if we don't get the gist of the historical portion, these stories that we're studying right now, if we don't get the gist of that and just go into the prophetic portion without the historical picture, we're going to miss the point. Because the point is really not about, if we in terms of what we've read so far and studied so far, it's not about the statue, it's not about the fiery furnace, Tuesday night we're going to be studying about the lion's den. It's not about the lions. It's not about the beast, it's not about the little horn, it's not about the king of the north, not about the king of the south. It's like, well, what is all this about? It's about worship the true God of heaven in the context of the devil working through all these kingdoms to try to get the nations of the world to worship him. So it's the big picture, isn't it? Now, I do believe it's important to understand the details of Bible prophecy because it tells us much information about how God works in the settings when the devil's trying to lead the nations in another direction. So God is kind enough to give to Daniel and to Nebuchadnezzar information way ahead of time. And kind enough to you and I who live, 2,600 years later. And we can look back and see how history has unfolded. And we're going to be studying minute detail of Bible prophecy, so minute in some of the movements of the king of the north and the king of the south. And it boggles my mind to think that, God would say, not only here are the 4 general worldwide empires, but here's all the fine-tuned details of who's going to marry who 2,600 years ahead.
Well, like Cyrus before he was even born.
Yeah.
Perfect example.
Yeah, perfect example. What a God we serve.